A luxurious car was bouncing in the holes and hills. It would seem like your internal organs would relocate because of the jarring. We should have gotten the right car for these kinds of roads, Michael thought to himself. The further they went from the city, the more doubts crept into his uncertain spirit. What am I even doing? What am I running from? He asked himself. What if I get stuck out here? Who's going to come and pull me out? Michael continued arguing with himself, more frustrated now. The decision to buy an abandoned ranch house in a godforsaken place came unexpectedly. He was tired of everything and wanted to run and hide from the whole world. He'd had enough of his fancy apartment, expensive cars, and the self-centered people around him. So, buying some rundown house in some far-off place seemed like an excellent decision. An escape. Getting farther from those sympathetic looks, from their repulsive support, from his own helplessness, from the inability to change anything or bring something back, and from the feelings that it would never be like it was before. But understanding you can't run from this terrible feeling of loss and the crazy emptiness inside no matter how you try, but suddenly, Michael angrily hit the steering wheel and the horn drowned out his music. Nothing helped and nothing could deaden the pain. Amanda, whatever will I do without you? It turned out there was a couple dozen people in this tiny town. The house was on the outskirts by the forest. I wonder if there's even electricity here. I didn't check. But what can you expect for the price? It should be somewhere around here. Michael saw what was once a mailbox among the vegetation. There it is. Michael got out of his car and looked around. Well, you're not in New York, he said to himself. But the air is truly amazing. It's so easy to breathe, he said, taking a deep breath. There was a shabby house seemingly on its side in front of the young man. Everything was covered in grass and wild grapes. So, I'll build a new home, raise some animals, and become a great farmer, he thought to himself, ironically. It was time to look inside. Michael stepped up to the door and suddenly thought about the keys he didn't have. However, when he touched the door, he realized they weren't needed. What's being hid here anyway? To his surprise, the interior was very modest, but quite tidy. It smelled stuffy, so Michael rushed to open a window. A gust of fresh air flowed inside. Michael's attention was drawn to the fireplace, and for some reason, he immediately imagined himself sitting in front of it with the sound of crackling logs in his ears. There was a portrait of a woman over the mantel. You must have been the owner, Michael thought. He knew there was a Mrs. Stone who lived here. The house was empty for many years after her death until a strange man from New York came and bought what seemed like a place no one wanted. After looking around, Michael sat down on the sofa in the small living room. Maybe from emotion, maybe from the long and rough road, but either way, he fell asleep right then and there. Michael never used to dream. But here was the old woman from the portrait seemingly in front of him. She stood before him as if she was judging him for wearing such clothes, and lying down with his shoes on in the living room. Michael felt uncomfortable and justified himself, saying, I'm sorry, Mrs. Stone. I had a long road getting here. Her face relaxed and she suddenly started rubbing his hair, like a mother for a child. Michael opened his eyes. He sat on the edge of the sofa and looked carefully at the portrait. Probably from excess oxygen, he thought, and was very surprised to feel so energetic now. It was as if he had just come home from a week-long vacation. And most importantly, his heart felt lighter. He didn't feel crushed like he was under a heavy stone anymore. For the last 2 years, since his wife Amanda had died in a car accident, he hadn't felt anything like this. He lived under immense guilt the last 2 years. Guilt because he gave her that terrible car that she crashed. She didn't ask for it. She never asked for anything, even though he could give it to her. She was the only one that didn't love him for his money. She just loved him. She was everything to him, and he to her. Now, she was gone, and he still didn't know how to continue living without her. But suddenly, he felt at ease. But why? How? Michael looked at the portrait again. He didn't know why, but he decided to spend the night. There was nowhere to rush, and he continued to explore the home. He eventually came to the basement. He flipped a switch and there was no light, so he had to use his phone. He went down the stairs and suddenly bumped into something which screamed and started to fight and scratch. In the darkness, Michael somehow grabbed the fighter under their arm and took them into the light of his phone. It was a boy of about 10 years. "You're a thief, and I'm calling the police," he screamed. "Actually, I own this house, and it seems that you are the thief," Michael answered, dragging the boy up the stairs. "What do you mean? This is Mrs. Stone's house," the boy said. "It was up for sale, and I bought it," Michael answered calmly, standing the boy up. "Relax and tell me what you're doing, or I might have to call the police." The boy looked at the man unwelcomingly and with distrust. It was a skinny, dirty, redhead boy with curly hair and freckles. "I'm Mason. Mrs. Stone had some canned food in the basement and was okay with me taking them," he said, lowering his eyes. "You're hungry?" Michael asked. He said, "Let's go eat," without waiting for an answer. Michael had some fast food with him. Despite his money, fast food was his weakness. His friends often laughed at him for it. Maybe it was a habit from his childhood. Michael had a rough childhood. He didn't know his father, and as far as he could remember, his mother was always sick. He grew up and was raised on the streets, not always getting money for food legally. Mason relaxed over lunch and let go of his distrust and suspicion. Mason was actually a very chatty child who chattered ceaselessly. Michael learned that he was from a rough family. His parents abused alcohol and drugs. His mother overdosed first, with his father following soon after. He was sent to an orphanage that he quickly ran from and went home. No one needed that home, so no one looked for him there. Mason also said that Mrs. Stone was very nice. She helped him and even predicted his future. Mason's childhood stories brought a smile to Michael's face, but he carefully listened as well. "Will you spend the night here?" Mason asked suddenly. "I think so. It was a long, hard road, and I don't want to drive anymore." "Then you should light the fireplace. It's cold in here at night. You'll freeze." "I'll come later and bring you firewood," Mason said very matter-of-factly, thanked him for the lunch, and left. Surprisingly, Michael thought this small person, still a child, despite all the difficulties in his life, still didn't complain and was so full of life. He had something to learn. Michael remembered his childhood again, and then his wife. Later that day, as promised, Mason came with firewood and lit the fireplace. It became quite cozy. "Michael, are you very rich?" Mason asked out of nowhere. "A bit. Why do you ask?" Michael looked at him with surprise. "You bought a house, and you have an expensive car. Maybe you could help someone." "It's my friend. She's great. The best, actually. She needs surgery, but it's very expensive." Michael dreamed of Mrs. Stone again that night, sitting on her chair near his bed. In his dream, she said he wasn't to blame for his wife's death, and everything would be good now. She also said he would have a son and a daughter. In the morning, Michael woke up again feeling excellent. He hadn't slept that well in a long time. Nor did he feel so well rested and energetic. When he went outside, Michael suddenly noticed a woman's figure. He stood still because he thought it was Amanda for a second. The girl walked slowly and a bit odd, as if she was carefully considering every step. She suddenly stopped, turned her head, extended her hand, and said, "Hello." Michael approached to shake her hand, looked her in the eyes, and understood she was blind. "I'm Diana, and you must be Michael. Mason told me about you." Michael kept holding her hand and couldn't take his eyes away. She looked just like Amanda. Her voice was so nice, Mason never wanted her to stop talking. And her hands were so soft, he thought unexpectedly he was ready to guide her for the rest of his life. It was the same Diana that Mason said needed help. She went blind before she was a teenager, maybe because her father hit her. He often beat both her and her mother. The doctors told her there was a small chance surgery could restore her vision, but it was very expensive. So Diana had almost given up hope on seeing again. Michael's life had turned around over these 2 days. That same day, he said goodbye to Diana and Mason, promised to return soon, and went to New York. He found a clinic that agreed to operate on Diana, but there was no guarantee it would help. He also gathered documents for adoption. He went back to the ranch house and told Diana about the surgery, but he was worried about giving her false hope. There was no guarantee, after all. She said she was ready to try, and if it didn't work, then she would survive, since there was no hope for the surgery without Michael's appearance at all. Now he went to talk to Mason. How would he tell this boy he had known for just a couple of days that he wanted to adopt him? Michael thought about his words for a long time, and when he said it, Mason burst into tears. Michael was scared at first and didn't know what to do, but it turned out they were tears of joy for himself and Diana. The time came. Diana went through all the necessary pre-op tests and the surgery. The doctor said it was a success, and there was a 70% chance she would see again. Michael adopted Mason. The new home was being built quite quickly. The day came when Diana replaced her bandages, and it would become clear if she could see again. Michael and Mason stood in the room and nervously rocked back and forth. The nurse carefully removed the bandages, and Diana squinted and blinked. Everyone was waiting with bated breath. After a few minutes, she suddenly said, "I see you, my favorite boys." Michael got on his knees, worried, and finally said, "Marry me." She didn't expect that and was a bit in shock. "I have loved you since I first saw you, and I knew that day. I wanted to spend my life with you and raise children with you." "And I loved you even though I never saw you. Is that possible?" A year later, Michael and Diana already had 2 children. Mason now proudly calls himself an older brother.